Philip, I have a passionate desire to know whether God exists, but as soon as I ask that question, I say, okay, does that God intervene in the world the way a lot of theologies tell me he does? As soon as I ask that question, I'm saying, how does God interact with the world if he does intervene, if there is a God? So I got to get to those questions. How do I begin to address that question? How can God interact with a physical world?
It's a deep dilemma, because if you have a God that can't do anything, you have deism. The creator God who, as Pascal said, snapped his fingers and left the stage. If you have a God who intervenes, then aren't you setting aside the laws of natural science? Haven't you made science impossible and set up a fundamental tension between science and theology? I think that's the sort of issue that theology most needs to wrestle with. No theist today in an age of science can put forward that position without having some answer to that quest.
Okay, so how do we begin to make progress?
I think we have to rule out some positions that are non-starters. So the God who just steps in with physical miracles right in the midst of this macro-physical world, that shuts down the possibility of science. That's not a God that I can affirm, though I admit that probably the majority of American Christians hold that view.
Well, that, of course, doesn't make it right, but I would say a large number of eminent theologians would have that view, and the view is that although the vast majority of the time there's regularity in the physical world, that God's laws just that he created occur, that God can intervene in those laws from time to time to kind of jiggle them a bit.
Yeah. I suppose I would see two areas that we could look that might make some progress. We know under a certain interpretation of quantum physics, the so-called Copenhagen interpretation, that there is uncertainty, indeterminacy at the level of the quantum superposition, and then a determinate state. And that transition is not a matter of natural law. So it might be that God intervened in that gap between the Schrödinger wave equation and the discrete states after the measurement.
That it's not a matter of law. I think it's in quantum physicists would say that there's a natural process. It may be unpredictable, any one given thing, but statistically, path integrals, all sorts of things is quite deterministic.
Precisely. So if God is doing anything at that level, and I'm skeptical, then God has to observe the probabilities. So at the end of however many millions of interventions, the probability distribution is unaffected. This is a very, complex God, having to fit everything out so the math always works out right in the end. But it is at least possible. No natural law would be broken if God intervened at that level.
Okay, all right. So that's one possibility.
Yeah.
You're skeptical?
The reason I'm so skeptical is it seems like a category mistake. Here you are down at the level of the mathematics of this fundamental reality in an area where we can do good empirical work. And suddenly you're saying, oh, there's an intentional agent who's underlying the probability distributions and sort of propping them up on his shoulders to make them work out right. If that's not a tinkering God, I don't know what is.
Okay, so you're saying that if you use that technique to get God sort of non-interventionally intervention in the process, it's sort of contradiction.
Right. It also is dependent on one particular interpretation of quantum physics, the Copenhagen interpretation. Right. I actually think that the better developments recently are decoherence theories, which are much more metaphysically parsimonious. They don't import as much stuff.
But either way, without dealing with what the true quantum theory is, which I don't think anybody really knows, but in order to try to, kind of shoehorn God into this, you reject it either way, no matter what your interpretation. That's not where it's going to happen.
Right.
But you need God to intervene if you believe in some sort of a theistic position.
Right. So for me, it all turns on the human person. And I can put it in very clear terms. Either we are ultimately the product of natural law, or we aren't. If human thought ultimately manifests some sort of natural law, then there's no place for divine action, because God would have to set aside those natural laws, which would make God doing physical miracles in exactly the same way as in the traditional view. But if it turns out that human thought is not the product of natural laws, but involves a non-law-like creativity, a pattern which is the result of human thought and intention, then for there to be a divine interaction would be no more breaking natural law than when you change my mind by your next comment.
I don't know if I'll do that. But it seems like you're driving an artificial distinction between the natural law that works in the physical world and the laws that produce the mental states that we have. Is that what you're doing? You're saying there's no laws? You're not saying that. It's not a random thing that our mentality is. It's based upon principles or laws. How are you differentiating here?
As an emergence theorist, I believe that over the course of evolution, you have systems arising with greater and greater levels of spontaneity. That the sort of constraints on the behavior of a flatworm, right, are less than the constraints on the behavior of an electron or a chemical solution. The constraints on the behavior of a dog engaged in play behaviors are less. And it seems to me that by the time you reach conscious thought, this is our own introspective awareness as well. By that point, we are able to make a decision and carry out actions.
Okay, so what you're saying is that by building in an emergent understanding of how the world works, particularly about our consciousness, that enables you to enable God, as it were, to come in and to interact and intervene, because that kind of God would be intervening in something that is an emergent property as opposed to a law-like property.
Yeah, I can put it in really simple terms. If we can interact and influence each other through our words and ideas, that you can lure me toward a position or cause me to turn away from a position, and that doesn't break any physical law, then thought-to-thought activity, that is, reasoning between human beings, personal influence, is a natural phenomenon. If that's true, it would be possible to imagine a type of rational being who had our sorts of abilities and, say, infinitely more, to be one of the factors that influences our thought.
And is it fair to even ask the question, how would that being do this?
Only if it's fair to say that we can explain our behavior, our mental behavior in terms of brain mechanisms. If that's false, if you can't give a mechanistic account of thought, it presupposes the brain working but is never reduced to the brain working, then it's possible to say, though I can't explain the mechanisms, that there's a divine influence or lure on human thought, which doesn't break natural law. Can I prove it? No. Can I assert it consistent with science? Yes.
All right. Let me give this to you. Let me assume that what you're saying is correct. I want to see what, if anything, follows from it. What can we infer about such a God, if that's the way the world is structured, that God can intervene, and the way he does interact is through these emergent properties? What can we say then about how that God created the universe?
That's a beautiful question, because it has us think about God in analogy with human interaction. And if we take that as our intuition pump, if you will, then we can imagine certain properties. This God is person-like, though greater and more powerful than persons. This God is relational, not sort of thought thinking itself in some pure Aristotle-like sense. God is involved in time. God is changing. God is incorporating into the divine being our own thoughts and offering back something in relationship.
Does that mean that God has really kind of, it seems like almost two modes of behavior here? One is sort of setting the rules, the physical rules in motion. The other being this kind of interaction with these emergent properties. Are there two ways that God works here?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to think of it. And if you pause for a moment, you can recognize that that's what theists have traditionally said. There's a role for God as creator of everything in the beginning, and there's a role for God as a force that interacts with humans. And under this conception, both of those are true. In some way, we have the God who sustains all things at all times, where the natural laws and regularities are an expression of the divine nature.
This is almost like an unconscious process, like our autonomic nervous system would work.
Yeah, I would imagine that it would be something of that sort of regularity, where God is the underlying non-conscious patterns in the world. But there's also a place for God to act in a way analogous to a human person, with intentions, goals, and desires.
And that has to be at this emergent level. This non-law level, is that what you're calling it?
Yeah, non-nomological is the way that we refer to it, not law-based. Now, if you said, well, what about God guiding evolution before humans are there? I know that the classic language of faith wants to speak that way, a kind of God pulling the process of evolution along.
Quasi-purposefully or something.
There I have to be agnostic. I don't see how God could be affecting bacteria without intervening into the molecules and into the biochemistry. And that, for me, is a science stopper.
But you can see how that God can intervene at the emergent level of our consciousness, but not at the biological level of the protoplasm.
Yeah. And the whole answer is based on a huge if. We don't know that we're free. If we're not free, there's no chance of saving divine action. If we are free, it's at least plausible that we freely interact not only with other human, finite conscious minds, but with infinite mind as well.